The Dickheads are presented in color.
Hey Dickheads! This pink laser beam of truth is coming from all over the world to your brain holes. Tonight I have 4 special guests who are going to talk to us about Asian science fiction in translation. Personally, as your host, I've read a little bit of science fiction from both countries, but admittedly I have more knowledge on China, but it's okay. I got 2 experts on Japanese science fiction, people who work in the field with it. So, going around, I'm going to introduce everybody. Tyran Grillo, can you tell us who you are and why you're here?
Yeah, I am Tyran, as you said, and thank you very much for having me and all of us. This is a great pleasure and an honor. I guess I'm many things. Currently, I'm a visiting professor at Clark University, where I focus on Japanese popular culture and film and literature. Also a music critic on the side with a passion for jazz and classical, and I translate whenever the time allows to do so. And I do Japanese fiction into English.
Awesome. Is Angus Stewart?
Okay, so I'm Angus Stewart. I'm also a podcast host. I'm the host of the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast. So that's fiction, not science fiction. The podcast's kind of like hookline or slogan or whatever you want to call it is all eras, all genres, all ideologies. But I do think one of our, well, I say our, it's just me, one of this podcast specialities is sci-fi. And that's basically just because I'm very interested in it. I've read just about, but not quite all that's available in English translation. And so I did a master's in publishing about 1.5 years ago. And for my dissertation, I did the publishing of like translated Chinese science fiction. And I was just in the process of looking up its title to remind myself. I can't remember the actual title, but I remember the subtitle, which actually describes what it is, was Chinese Science Fiction's Journey to the West. Although I've since learned that there are some ways you could criticize Journey to the West as a problematic use of the phrase, but who cares? That's what it was.
Well, I like the double meaning of it. Now, one of the guests you've had, and I've heard on your podcast, is Nathaniel Isaacson. Nathaniel, why don't you tell us who you are and why I had you here?
Yeah, I'm Nathaniel Isaacson. I'm an associate professor at North Carolina State University. I work in modern Chinese literature and cultural studies. And I guess I do a lot of translation after I've gotten all the other things that you have to get done as a professor finished. I really enjoy translating, and quite a that has been sci-fi. Yeah.
Well, and Nick Mamatas is the last person we're going to introduce. Nick, welcome. Tell everybody who you are and what you do.
I am a writer and editor. For 11 years, I worked for Viz Media, which is primarily a manga publisher, but we had a line of science fiction and translation for Pakistan. Tyran was one of our translators, and so after working for Viz for 11 years, I now work for 7 Seas Entertainment as a manga editor.
Oh, great. So back in the biz, as it were. So I'm going to talk about the roots of science fiction in both countries, as how it relates to how it kind of got started and what we know about the early days of it. But I think the Chinese tradition is much older, especially if you consider that Chinese fantasy and weird fiction is rooted centuries ago. That's been doing like probably the 2 classics of Chinese literature are fantasy novels with The Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Journey to the West. Nathaniel or Angus, whoever wants to start first, can you tell us, what are the roots of science fiction in Chinese culture?
I think Nathaniel is the real expert. I'd jump in and say the number of classics that usually gets rattled off is 4. And off the top of my head, there's Outlaws of the Marsh, which is pretty grounded in reality. Three Kingdoms, I don't know that much about it, but I'm pretty sure there's not really too much magic in that one. And then we've got Journey to the West, totally fantasy. And Dream of the Red Chamber, which is a really good point to hand off to Nathaniel Isaacson, because at the start of the 20th century, there is a sci-fi fanfic reimagining of that classic. I don't know an awful lot about those early roots. What I do know about the Chinese sci-fi that starts off the 20th century, or the turn of the 20th century, I know because I read Nathaniel's book, so I defer to him.
Yeah, I would say that in order to get the book published, I really cut out any of that stuff that arguably does present us with some of the roots of Chinese science fiction, and there are a lot of those fantastic roots and really important connections there between things like Journey to the West, or even the narrative styles, and a lot of the elements of things like Romance of the Three Kingdoms, or Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, right? Liao Jai Zhi, which is a lot of ghost stories. I cut that all out of my work just to make the project manageable. And then after having done that, I kind of realized that maybe I could have paid more attention to that stuff. I'd say the real emergence of it is, very late 19th, early 20th century, and when China was faced with imperial incursion from Europe and Japan. And to me, the most important thing about science fiction in China is that it's a response to imperialism and colonialism. And I would say one of the really neat things about that is that I mostly limited that to things that people were calling science fiction. And you have that word in China by 1902. And I think that's like basically a retranslation from Japanese 科学小说 of Kagaku Bungaku, right? But interestingly, you kind of have this as a genre category before you have it in the United States, right? But that doesn't mean the genre wasn't already there in the West. Mostly it's in translation, and it gets picked up in sequels like Angus was alluding to, with New Story of the Stone, which is a great novel.
So Nathaniel, what I'm wondering there is, were works like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells getting translated into China? And
yes, absolutely.
Is that
Yeah.
So some of the proto and the early science fiction before Hugo Gernsback gave it the scientific fiction, we were seeing the works of speculative fiction from the West also. And I'm not saying the West is the reason. Let me be clear on that. I'm just saying I was wondering if it was being read there at the time.
Yeah, and I think there's a thorny argument there, right? Because the idea of stimulus response and that China would not have been modern without Western incursion, I think that's been heavily criticized, and for good reason. But it's also true that science fiction as it was first available in China in translation, with things like you said, Jules Verne.
Yeah. Well, and I did. In some of my research, I read that Jules Verne novels were very popular in China. That once they got translated there, that particularly Jules Verne was very popular. So that's one of the reasons why I asked that. But as far as Japan is concerned, Japan also has a long history of fantastical fiction. I was reading about a 10th century book called The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, which I've never read, but I read of its existence, that this was kind of like proto-science fiction because it was about a princess from the moon who was sent to Earth. Have Nick or Tyran, have either of you read the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter? Because that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's perhaps with particular regard to Japan where the concept of genre gets a little blurry, because I think there is a more gradual transformation from what would be considered hardcore mythology to hardcore science fiction. And the line between those, I think, is protracted over time, and perhaps fascinatingly so, has been often difficult to disentangle. But I think the real turning point, perhaps, and if one was to define a breaking point, it would be World War II, because that's when I think the science of science fiction really comes into play more heavily. And of course, there are authors like Oshikawa Shundo, who wrote very much in the Jules Verne vein. But really, after World War II, you have people like Tezuka Osamu, who is probably sort of the godfather of contemporary science fiction in Japan. And that's another point of interest, however, because obviously as a manga artist, one would not slot him into the category of pure literature, so to speak. And that's another dynamic, I think, to keep in mind, that he wasn't necessarily among the high intellectual literati of his time. But obviously, in retrospect, we know that he's worthy of inclusion in whatever ranks one would place him in Japanese literary history. But certainly the visual component, I think, allowed readers to appreciate the depth of his stories and vice versa, and how those shaped contemporary science fiction in Japan as an explicit and direct reaction to the nuclear anxiety of the war.
Right. Well, and I didn't realize that manga, I mean, just because my ignorance when I started researching for this episode, I didn't realize that manga was like kind of post-World War II, that it's been going on that long, that, of course, that's just my ignorance, but and one of the authors that you mentioned, I did read about his submarine war novel from 1900.
Yeah, that's from 1900, and it's interesting because that's the same exact year that Journey to the Center of the Earth appeared in Japanese as well. So that was sort of a watershed moment in both the Western tradition and the Japanese tradition, so to speak. And but it's hard to say how much of that was influenced by Western speculative fiction at the time, and how much was just again the anxiety of modernism and the sort of I guess simpatico effect of the Industrial Revolution on the creative mind.
So I'm wondering how Imperial Japan affected this fiction, because I know this novel from 1900 was about a Russian-Japanese war.
Some people think it was sort of prophetically
5 years ahead,
forecasting the Russo-Japanese War. But I think those anxieties that I think one would normally associate with an imperially minded culture were inevitably appearing in precisely that kind of fiction. So I think it's more of a historical inevitability than anything else.
Right. And was any of this science fiction from this era getting away with metaphor for criticism of the empire? Was that a thing? Or
I actually have no idea, because that's a period I'm very fuzzy about, so I wouldn't be able to speak to that.
Sure.
I would imagine probably not. There might have been some more underground literary circles, but I'm not really quite sure.
Well, and I think what's happening with modern Chinese science fiction is that readers in the West are trying way too hard to force the idea that these Chinese authors are criticizing their country, to the point where sometimes, especially like with Vagabonds that came out this last year, like people were trying way too hard to make it look like Hong Jingfang is like criticizing China when she's kind of an idealist, right? But we'll get to modern sci-fi later. And but Nick, how did you get involved in and I kind of want to start with Nick and work backwards, how you personally discovered reading Japanese fiction and working with it.
Well, like anybody, I was a kid in the 80s and 70s, so I saw a few things here and there, anime and whatnot. Often horribly translated or cut to pieces and re-stitched together with new characters and that sort of thing. But my origin really was looking for a job in publishing. A friend sent me a listing for Viz, and I said, "Oh, are you a fan of anime and manga?" And I went, "No," which seemed like the wrong thing to say, but in fact was the right thing to say, because working in the field, whenever there's any kind of job opening in any of the manga companies working in the U.S., whether it's to be the janitor or to be an accountant, people say, "Well, I don't know anything about being a janitor or an accountant. I love manga," and they wanted someone who didn't love manga but who loved science fiction and could bring the science fiction background into the job. And so that's how I got the job. But after, of course, 12 years of it, I was being steeped in it. All my coworkers, where manga was flying all over the office, of course, I got heavily involved in that as well.
Yeah, and so coming to it from the perspective of not being a fan, like, how do you think, or Was there a moment where you were like, wow, they're doing like really cool and interesting stuff that I hadn't seen before? Or like, how long did that kind of take for you for that to sink?
About 35 seconds, honestly. The first time I got the manuscript, it was, aha! All my misconceptions were based around essentially almost a parody of Japan as it appeared in Western cyberpunk.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That must be what Japanese science fiction like is. Nope, actually it's not. Japanese science fiction, at least in the past 30, 40 years, is still heavily influenced by hard science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And if you talk to a Japanese science fiction author, say, who's your favorite? Arthur C. Clarke is my favorite, or her short fiction. Oh, I love Frederick Brown. And much of my job, especially early on in editing these works of science fiction, we're trying to figure out what obscure to us Western story were they referencing.
Right.
And I had to find like these obscure Frederick Brown stories that I could only find on Google in Spanish, and use my high school pen to figure it out with it in English and go, aha, that's what he means in Japanese. Now I got it.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, and Arthur C. Clarke comes up a lot with the Chinese science fiction writers as well.
Although but in the West, he's barely read anymore.
Right.
In the West, generally speaking, what happens is when you die, you go out of print.
Yeah. Yeah.
And other countries, that's not necessarily the case. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, Nathaniel, how did you get into Chinese translation and fiction? Because you do it all, right? Like not just science fiction, right? You do.
Yeah, a long time ago, I thought I would go into Chinese because I was going to learn the language and go into business. And it took a very small taste of that to realize I didn't want to do that at all.
Yeah.
I love the language. It's actually, a whole bunch of languages and an entire civilization, right? So it was just this fascinating, never-ending deep dive that you could get into. And I found that I really loved that, and I loved teaching. The dissertation that became a book was an attempt to do something that I thought was really manageable. At the time, to the best of our knowledge, there were only just enough Chinese sci-fi stories that you could make a dissertation out of it. And then it's just completely exploded, where we found all these things that were missed. And then the genre, in the contemporary period has just completely exploded. So I no longer would even dare to say that I have a grasp on all of the Chinese sci-fi that's out there. But when I started to go into it, I thought I could be the guy who knew all of it anyway.
Well, and it helps that we're talking about just the translated stuff, because I know the stuff that's out there is much deeper than what we're able to get in English. But Nathaniel too, your sci-fi origin involves our man PKD, because I remember, because of Angus's podcast, you mentioned that you were a dickhead as well. So I believe, right? Am I correct?
Yeah, as a teenager, I think another part of getting into Chinese is maybe kind of related to that anything that seemed a little bit alternative or something growing up in the mid 90s. And Philip K. Dick was one of those things that I got into. Had like a Stephen King kick, went on for a while until I realized that it's just the same 800-page novel almost every time. But I was into him for a little bit. Philip K. Dick seemed like really out there. And I think similar to what Nick is talking about, you go downtown and you discover these really wild, Terry Gilliam movies or whatever on the shelf at the video store, and bring that home. And then you go over to the manga shop and you find some kind of comic that just got translated from Japan, and you're just really blown away by all that as a kid, right? And so just sort of sampling from whatever I could find. Wandering around downtown Flagstaff, Arizona, where I grew up.
Well, yeah, and actually, I think you mentioning PKD to Angus on the podcast was the genesis of this episode, because that was the beginning of me thinking, like, yeah, I should really bring all these folks together. But Angus, how did you get into Chinese fiction? I mean, you lived in China for a couple of years as well, right?
Yeah, if I hadn't lived there, well, who knows, actually. If I hadn't lived there, I might have still gone down the rabbit hole. It's much less likely, though. So I think I've told this story on the podcast a few times, so I've got it fairly, I can bang this one out fairly concisely. So living in China, most of what I wanted to read was, almost all of what I wanted to read for most of the time I was there was not Chinese, because it was a little bit like, You're away from home. What movies do you want to watch? The movies that remind you of home. What food for you is a treat? Is it noodles or pizza? It's going to be a pizza. So I didn't really fixate on reading Chinese stuff until I'd gone home and was missing China. But the stuff I did read while I was there is three things, three pieces of translated Chinese fiction. One was Diary of a Madman by Lujun, which he's an important guy in the history of Chinese sci-fi without being a sci-fi writer, because he was translating things like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells into Chinese from Japanese, I think. Yeah, thanks, Nathaniel. I was pretty sure that was right. So it was that. I read, I perhaps regret this, but I read a translation of Dream of the Red Chamber. So it was an ebook, so I didn't realize it was a doorstopper. And that kind of put me off. But eventually, somewhere down the road, I saw an article about the three-body problem. I think its hype from being on President Obama's reading list was starting to take off, and it was starting to get coverage. And the article, it talked about the themes and stuff, but what hooked me was the elevator pitch of the plot, that aliens are coming for humanity, and humanity has not months to get ready, but centuries. So humanity has to cohere and come up with a generation by generation plan. And I was like, that's such a good premise. And I'm not a hardcore sci-fi reader either. The sci-fi I'd read before was just here and there. One Asimov novel, a lot of Ian Banks, my countryman, my dead countryman. So I wouldn't necessarily be sold on something just because it was Chinese sci-fi, but I heard that plot hook and the general sort of geopolitical themes. It was like, oh, I need to read this. So I powered through the trilogy pretty fast. And the end of Death's End moved me to tears, which is weird considering how non-emotional most of those books are. But it left a huge impact. And then upon getting home, as I started doing a publishing master's and was like, wait, here's a niche I could pursue here. I could learn all about Chinese fiction that gets translated into English. And it was particularly interesting for me to look at what's your bog standard Chinese book that gets brought into English versus the three-body problem, because three-body problem made a massive splash in English, made a huge amount of sales, whereas I think other Chinese stuff that had been brought into English previously had carried some cultural prestige but never sold very well. Like the example I can throw off the top of my head is Mo Yan. So he won a Nobel Prize. His writings are sometimes somewhat critical of the Chinese system, which of course Western publishers and readers love, but he's apparently never sold very well. So a big focus of my dissertation and now my podcast is trying to follow the hook line, all eras, all genres, all ideologies, because all genres really means getting away from the prestigious, serious literary fiction and seeing if Western readers would be interested in reading like Chinese crime books, Chinese sci-fi, wuxia is a big one actually that I'm only just starting to learn about now. All eras, that one is less interesting for me because I think there are people who are interested in modern China and there's plenty of people who are interested in ancient China. It's maybe the pre-communist parts of the 20th century that are the most interesting unexplored ground there. And all ideologies, because you shouldn't have to pick between propaganda and a dissident. It's important to listen to both of those sides, especially the dissidents, but you're never going to understand China if you think every author and artist and creator is a rebel, because that's not the reality.
Yeah. So. No, that's a very important point that we will get to, especially when we talk about Vagabonds later, which I have read this year. Tyran, what's your origin story as far as getting into this field?
Interestingly, my introduction to science fiction had, in a strange way, something to do with East Asia from the very beginning. So my all-time favorite sci-fi work of literature is David Wingrove's Zhongguo. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was published in maybe the 90s in the States, but he's a British author, so I think it's originally published in the UK. But the publisher pulled the plug on his last two novels in the series, so he had to smush volumes 8 and 9 into one. So fans were always hungry for more. In the past few years, he's rewritten the entire series as a 20-volume magnum opus the way he wanted to. So that has always remained a touchstone for me. That was actually in my teens at around the time when I was first getting into East Asian culture in general, both Chinese and Japanese. So then I had a really close friend in high school from Tokyo, and he was constantly talking about this PlayStation video game called Parasite Eve, and then came back from break one year and said, "Hey, here's the novel based on, that the video game was based off of, and let me tell you about it." Of course, it was not translated yet. So I became really fascinated by how in-depth the novel was, having already played the video game. And so I promised him that I would translate it one day, whenever my Japanese abilities ever got to that point. So he gave me his copy of the novel, and in my junior year of Japanese studies, I ended up publishing it. I have to bow graciously to my editor, and also to the author, who, as a practicing pharmacologist, is fluent in English and hand wrote corrections on my entire manuscript, basically correcting every scientific term that I managed to flub in my translation, including the glossary that he includes in the back of the book, full of scientific terminology. So it was, a huge, steep learning curve for me. I'd never, studied abroad in Japan, and my linguistic skills were purely, on the page. So, but it was a really great experience. Although I translated a lot of different genres in Japanese fiction, sci-fi has always been my foundation, and it's something that I constantly return to.
Okay, so let's talk about what the culture, or let's talk about how the history of translation of this work in this genre has happened. Because for me, my introduction to Chinese fiction was mostly through, in college, I had to read. I was excited to read The Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Journey to the West, because I had seen 1,000 movies based on them, between all the Shaw Brothers movies and all, because I was a Kung Fu movie dork. And so I had that experience in college when I read The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. I'm like, well, this chapter is like this Shaw Brothers movie, and this chapter is like that. Oh my gosh. And then realizing that Tales from a Chinese Studio, I also read that one of my favorite Hong Kong films is Chinese Ghost Story, which is obviously inspired by Tales from a Chinese Studio, which, by the way, is straight up Bizarro. And when we talk about the Bizarro writing community, I always tell people, you gotta read Tales from a Chinese Studio, because it's like proto Bizarro from that era. It's just so fucking weird. But at some point, there became a modern scene. And what do we know about how this community grew? And let's start with China. Either one of you guys jump in. How did this community grow before it got discovered by translators, like in the 20th century? That's a big question, I know.
Yeah, I think I wish I knew the exact years these were happening. I think it's biannual or so, but a lot of it is through conventions, right? So I know there were, every couple of years there were conventions, I think especially in Chengdu, that were happening. And that's where this really got started. And not until, after 2005 was when that community started to realize that sci-fi in China actually existed. And so I think that was a really common experience, that even if you told Chinese folks or people who studied literature in China, I'm working on science fiction, before 2013 even, a lot of people would just say, wait, we have science fiction? Or if you walk into a bookstore in Beijing or Shanghai, and you'd say, where's the sci-fi section? And you get led over to the fantasy section, or the wuxia xiaoshuo section, right? And so I think without fandoms, it really wouldn't have existed. And that's a thing I wish I knew more about. But those started to get going, like I think a little bit after 2005.
But Japan had so much more science fiction and manga and so much going on. So I don't think that was less of a thing in Japan, right? Like there was an active sci-fi community throughout. Am I correct, Nick or Tyran?
Yeah. And again, I'm not really an expert on sort of the prehistory of science fiction, but I know that it was perhaps, taken more seriously as such, at an earlier point, compared to China, for example.
Yeah, I just want to throw this out there. It's kind of a pet theory I have, but I like speaking about Tezuka Osamu. I think that copyright law in Japan is really important. Because you could get like the manga or the anime, right? But Mark Steinberg has written about how you could get so many other like kids' toys or chocolates or whatever, and just any consumer product possibly related to that character is available in Japan and protected in the same way that Disney protected their stuff. And that doesn't exist in China. So the way that fandoms interact with the products and the way that they make it out into the market is really different.
And I think that's another advantage of having that sci-fi foundation in art forms like manga and anime, because the sheer age range and demographic range of possible fans is so great, and it allows for that sort of cross-pollination, of fandom to emerge at a very early time.
Well, one thing that the Japanese science fiction community has that the Chinese didn't early on is something like Peridon Press that was like that started as fan translations. Am I correct? Or Nick, do you know the history of that? Because I know you work with them, haven't you?
I don't necessarily, but I think one thing that's important is how Japanese publishing works. Was, in my mind, very useful for science fiction in particular, especially given that science fiction, despite novels selling very well, is ultimately, I think, a genre that is best served in short fiction and novella-length fiction, because it's a conceptual base, here's a premise. And Japanese publishers almost always publish via magazines as well as books, and they cultivate new writers by series of contests. And once you get in the winter contest, you get published with a story, whether mystery, science fiction, romance, etc., you're sort of in. And they also spend a lot of time, this is true of manga as well, even if you are an aspiring mangaka, never published anything, you can get a meeting with an editor, starting as a kid. And they'll spend years saying, oh, throw this away, try something else. As opposed to, say, the Western version of sending stuff in, and maybe you get a rejection, maybe you don't, who knows, and 10 years later somehow you hit. So there's a lot of cultivation of new writers and of forms of fiction that are very amenable to science fiction. And I would say that fandom in Japan has a fanzine fandom. There's a big underground of people rewriting manga and remixing traditional characters in different ways, sort of like fan fiction here in the US. But I would say, my suspicion is that publishing mainstream came first, then a fandom emerged. And Japanese fandom is very heavily influenced by US fandom, as it stood about 30 years ago. So I would invite like Circons, and I had to explain to my boss, well, what is a Circon? Oh, a Circon is a serious convention. Which is a term of art not even used by American fandom anymore, people who are younger than me. I'm like the youngest person who knows what the word Circon means in the United States. Except for now, all of you. Right?
Well,
yeah, that's a really excellent point about publishing. Sorry, I just want to add.
Go ahead.
For example, one of the sci-fi authors that I've translated more recently, I had lunch with him in Osaka a few years ago, and I was asking him, how did you ever get published? Because his stories are rather bizarre, for lack of a better term, but wonderfully so. And he was just telling me how easy it is, compared to his understanding of Western literary processes, how to get published. Because basically, he had exactly the same experience as Nick described. He would just sort of, meet with an editor, and then they hit it off, and then he would just keep sending him stuff until the editor said, "Oh yeah, I'll take this one," and instead of just being totally brushed off, as a wannabe. And what's interesting though is that even though there's a lot of editorial quality control, there's, I think, a certain freedom of ideas that I find very exciting in Japanese science fiction, because there seems to be a marked lack of a filter on content. There's certainly a lot of
Chinese too.
yeah,
I would say Chinese science fiction too.
yeah, so I think that creates, it's sort of a blessing and the curse. You can get a lot of crap out there, but you can also get some pretty brilliant ideas squeezing through the ringer. And if you're lucky enough to encounter them, then it works out well for both parties.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I found when Kurdon sent me Speculative Japan, just every story that I read, I was like, okay, this is nothing I would read otherwise. Well, some of them are I agree, Nick. There are some things that play off tropes that we've seen in other stories, but they always have that edge that it's coming from a different culture. It means different. Yeah. So
when we published a lot of hard science fiction in Haikasuru was, I love hard science fiction, but two, I hate hard science fiction. Because in the U.S., especially, hard science fiction is essentially propaganda for the Libertarian Party. And
a lot of times.
Economics is just like physics, it's just the science, and of course it's going to be libertarian economics. And then in Japan, of course, it's a Japanese nationalism instead. This is the driving political theme of hard SF. And so, the edge is always from different culture, different societies. Now, I wasn't trying to say that Japanese SF just hates US SF.
Yeah.
But the influences are heavily there, and they are influences that you would see in contemporary American SF.
All right, so Angus, you were talking about censorship in early Chinese sci-fi. Did you want to expand on that?
Yeah. So you guys were saying all the reasons why Japanese genre fiction and sci-fi, I guess, has really taken off, and it probably bears mentioning why it was so late into the 20th century that Chinese sci-fi kind of bounced back. So it's not just censorship; it's political upheaval in general, and then maybe more in the communist era, state control of culture has basically stopped what has become of Chinese sci-fi happening earlier. So we mentioned earlier that at the start of the 20th century, you had this kind of embryonic Chinese sci-fi that writers were creating in reaction to basically, Western imperialism and an urge to modernize, perhaps sometimes by outright copying the science fiction coming in, perhaps by lending it some Chinese characteristics, in quotes. And then I didn't know exactly why there was a dry spell after that into the 20s and 30s. I learned recently from Nathaniel's book that basically other concerns kind of took over. The writers who took off at the kind of end of the Qing dynasty, start of the Republican era, the May 4th movement writers, their focus moved away from science fiction onto just science, really, or realism as a literary style. And also within the country, I guess they entered a warlord era where the real problem was inner turmoil rather than attacks from outside, from what I understand. So there's one really interesting Chinese sci-fi novel from the 30s, Cat Country, but between the end of the Qing dynasty to the Communist Revolution is nothing. And that's not a result of censorship. That's just kind of cultural tides. But then after the revolution, so what, into the 50s, 60s, 70s, the Mao era, from what I've learned, not because I've read or studied hardcore, but what I've learned on my sort of journey is that there was sort of Soviet-style sci-fi, but it was just there to either propagandize about the new China or to teach kids some stuff about space or science. So not really what we would think of as literary science fiction. After the death of Mao, China went into its reform and opening era, where the leader, as we know, the Communist Party stayed in charge, but they tried relaxing the culture and the economy and so on. But there was a moment, I don't know the exact year, Nathaniel might know, where things sort of culturally took a backwards turn. The communist leaders decided that they weren't happy with what they saw as, Western decadence or something. So there was a thing called the anti-spiritual pollution movement. I think just before that, a story had come out. It was called something like Little Smarty or Little Know-It-All Travels the Universe. by Nathaniel will correct me.
Yonglia.
Yonglia, yeah. And I think that was a sign of possible better things to come. But then the government said, no, too much Western culture, sci-fi is a Western genre, away with it. So it kind of got pushed underground again, and I guess bubbled back to the surface, I think in around the 90s, and that resurgence ended up giving us Three Body Problem and Liu Cixin and his sort of cohort of writers, and now we have a younger cohort reaching us. So yeah, so long story short, there's a reason why there's been a lag, China's lag behind Japan, if we're just looking at those two countries.
Well, and Japan also had an era that I read about where they called it the wintry age for science fiction, where there was less being published. So it kind of happened that same way in both countries. But I want to eventually get into where we just talk about titles and we just talk about things that people should look for. But before we do that, we have to talk about the two books that kind of broke the dam for each culture. And we're really lucky to have somebody who worked on one of those books for the Japanese, which we'll get to. We obviously Three Body Problem is one for China, but the one for Japan that I think really broke it through to the mainstream is All You Need Is Kill, because it got Tom Cruise in film, and but I think that book is crucial. Am I correct? It just seems to me that that is as mainstream a penetration as Japanese science fiction has had in the West. Can you tell us, Nick, about All You Need Is Kill and how you got involved with that book and what it is?
Although I would still say I agree with Tyran that manga is still more important than prose fiction.
Sure.
And we're talking about Japanese science fiction penetrating in the West. Pokemon is far more mainstream and far more vital, and is a kind of science fiction, even though it's for children.
Yeah.
And weird ecology, and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, as far as prose science fiction goes, I would definitely say All You Need Is Kill is probably second to Japan Sinks, which has been around for many decades, and of course it's huge in Japan too, and remains like a classic of science fiction. But All You Need Is Kill was one of the first novels we did at Viz. For the Hakusuba line. It was the first, it was going to be the fourth. And we said, well, why this should be the first. And at the time, there was an idea that Viz, not to tell tales of school, Viz was going to do a lot of movies, and they would make a lot of, and they even had a producer that they brought from DreamWorks to be an employee at Viz to produce movies, and they had asked me, well, of the books you're going to be doing, do you have any good ideas for movies? I said, ideas for good movies? I said, no. Good ideas for movies. It's different than ideas for good movies. So that was the first thing I learned about publishing. And so I pitched All You Need Is Kill. The most widely reproduced sentence I've ever written in my life is Groundhog Day meets Starship Troopers. That was my pitch to them. That became in the press release, and we did in every newspaper in the country for 3 months. And for those who don't know, All You Need Is Kill is essentially takes the form of a shonen manga, and that it's about a young guy who is a loser and gets blasted and killed, but he comes back and gets stronger every time. He learns a few things, has a rival, makes friends with a rival, there's a bigger enemy. So it is a classic shonen manga, battle manga style story. And it also feels like a video game where you die and you start over again, you get better at the video game every time. So it had three things going for it. It had reminiscent of classic science fiction like Heinlein, one of Heinlein's juveniles. It felt like a manga, and we had 20 years of kids reading manga, and it felt like a video game, and everyone plays video games. So that really took off. And we found a guy to write a script. The script sold for millions of dollars, which is almost impossible. Almost nobody buys scripts on spec anymore, but this is bought on spec. Then Tom Cruise got a hold of it and said, we got to do this movie. So they threw the script away because the film's about a 18-year-old Japanese guy, not a 50-year-old American man. And many, many revisions later, All You Need Is Kill came out and did pretty well. It was never number one. It was number 3 when it premiered at the box office. But it held up through word of mouth. And we had a mass market edition of All You Need Is Kill. under the title Edge of Tomorrow, and it was in IMAX. It was given away at IMAX theaters, and by the time I left, it was swinging in its 9th or 10th printing.
Mm.
So yeah, that was a very powerful moment for Japanese SF. Although, of course, the version people are most familiar with is barely Japanese at all.
Mm.
There was even versions of, well, we have a Japanese scientist. No, get rid of him. No, we have an American scientist. The Japanese bit that shows up are two things, one of which I kind of helped with. In the Japanese version, the female lead is called the Bitch of the Battlefield. We change it to Full Metal Bitch. And then in the film, someone says, "It's the Full Metal," and he gets knocked out before they say bitch. That was like my one thing that I was able to stick through with the variations and appear on screen. And at one point, they were all in battle armor, which is, of course, a very common Japanese trope and also a very common American trope. And it starts talking to them in Japanese as that malfunctions, and it's sort of a cheery, anime-esque voice actor voice. So yeah, Japanese made it big, except once we got rid of all the Japanese stuff.
But
So that was a problem.
But it did help get the book out there and get attention.
Absolutely, sure. You know, any movie, even if it's totally whitewashed, as they say, and it was wrongly whitewashed, I agree, is nonetheless a commercial that's 2 hours long that people paid to see for the book.
Right.
And if you work in advertising, a long commercial and people pay to watch it, great. So on some level, that was fantastic.
Tyran, did you read that book in Japanese, or were you familiar with it before it became a sensation?
Actually, I actually wasn't familiar with that novel before the film came out, but I did look at it in Japanese, around the time that the film came out.
Amazingly, it wasn't huge in Japan, and Sakurazaki is not a huge writer in Japan. He's not prolific enough to be huge there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Once you're published in Japan, you're expected to go on the treadmill of publishing constantly. So if you're writing hard science fiction novels, and some newspaper says, "Oh, will you write an essay for us about the importance of Valentine's Day?" You're going to do it.
Yeah.
I'm going to say no afterward.
Mm-hmm.
And Sakurazaki was like, "I'm going to say no. Maybe I'll do a sequel, maybe not." And when he got a wheelbarrow full of Hollywood money, he definitely realized he could take it easy, unlike many Japanese authors.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a mid-list book, actually kind of a light novel. It was illustrated. It had relatively simple kanji.
Mm-hmm.
So it was designed almost like what we call a young adult novel.
Mm.
And wasn't huge until it became huge in America. And then it got huge there, too, and they had a manga adaptation, which is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
It was done by a top mangaka, and then it has become a classic.
Mm.
Yeah, and I do think that because I know for it was weird. I had just in my tiny little experiences that I had on my blog, I had a review of Speculative Japan, and the week after Edge of Tomorrow came out, like for some weird reason, I had like 200 extra hits on my on my blog just of the Speculative Japan review, and I was like, it was this weird thing that I've never forgotten, like how, and it's not even that detailed of a review, right? So I was like, it taught me something about like how the penetration of these things. And I think with Three Body Problem, it was definitely Obama, like blurbing it, which was bizarre. And people have asked me, like, why did Obama blurb this? Like, I can read his mind or something. But, and because I'm a science fiction guy. But my only thought was this idea that, and Angus, you mentioned this with Three Body Problem, is part of the idea of Three Body Problem is like, we have this transformational change we have to make happen, and we have to think long term about it. I think for a politician, that was very interesting.
That's the very Sunshine and Daisies reading of why Obama might be interested in it. Because I think I didn't mention is it's really dark, and it's about a confrontation of two incompatible cultures. Or not to spoil things too much, but there's a sort of the idea of at least the second book in the trilogy is that realpolitik, so everyone has to kill each other, is baked into the universe itself. And we're in an era where China is, if you're doom and gloom sort of person, then you might think we're heading for another Cold War, in which case Three Body Problem is a great book to read.
Well,
and I could go more into that.
There's one of those things about American science fiction publishing is that you see blurbs where two books are combined with each other, and they actually have nothing to do with the book itself. with Three Body Problem, that was when it got compared to Dune and Independence Day, which, it has,
It's the best and the worst.
yeah, it has more to do with Stanislaw Lem's His Master's Voice or Asimov's The Gods Themselves, but that's not going to sell copies of books. So we'll try to make you think of the White House getting blown up in Independence Day. And so it was weird to me as somebody who, I read it very early on when it got published because I was like, oh, neat, Chinese sci-fi, I'm going to read this. And when it kind of blew up, it was weird to me because I was like, man, this is hard sci-fi. Like, really, it's not a very commercial thing. So it was very surprising to me when it took off. For Nathaniel, how did you, as somebody who followed all this, what was it like watching that book kind of blow up?
I'm kind of strange, and I've kind of been rewatching that retroactively. I think a lot of, I would reiterate what Angus pointed out, that it seems that this is sort of a geopolitical thing going on, right? Mm-hmm. And for someone who's been back and forth between the United States and China for the last 20 years, it seemed like we had to become aware of this and aware of the the rise of China, and on the kind of threatening end of it, the Thucydides trap of two great powers that will inevitably end up at war with one another, is a theme in the book and a theme in the way that people in both China and the U.S. talk about the relationship between those two countries. I think there's, like, as far as getting popular in the United States, there's this weird connection to woke culture too, right? I don't know how much you guys spend on here talking about sad puppies and that whole thing. I kind of,
for sure.
I kind of wonder how much Liu Cixin winning was just a big fuck you to the incels, right? And I mean, Angus has talked about how dark the novel is. I would say it's social Darwinist and maybe kind of fascist. Liu Cixin he's not my favorite. And Angus also talks about how it sort of lacks an emotional core. And so,
although I stand by that at the end, it will break your heart. But yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, he's really fascinating. It's hard for me to like get my head around exactly what it is that I'm not quite connecting with Liu Cixin on, because it's an amoral universe too, and I love writing that's about an amoral universe. Like all my top just fiction writers in general, I would say, fit in that category. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I think it has something to do with American fan cultures latching onto it, maybe just because it was something else, right?
All right, so let's get into titles and stop talking about generalizations of the scene in the community and get into like...
No, let's not. Let's talk about Three Body Problem a little bit more, because I've got some opinions.
Okay. All right, no, give your opinion then on Three Body Problem.
Well, I am convinced that Obama's annual lists are partially contrived by publicists.
What? Impossible.
No!
And publishing publicists, and Obama has the kind of a geek chic to him, and he's talked about he likes Star Trek and that kind of thing. And I am almost certain that Macmillan, with its immense power as one of the big five publishers, got that on that list. Not to say they didn't read it, but I'm just saying it got on that list due to some influences. And I also think it's very helpful in two grounds. One, my experience work publishing Japanese science fiction, one thing I ran into a lot, which was a huge problem, was that people would sample. They'd say, Japanese science fiction, that's interesting, great. I'll buy one of these books. And they did, and they read it, and they enjoyed it, and that was it. And now I've read Japanese science fiction, I'll go back to reading whatever I want. And so we've had a few, so in Hakuso we had a couple hits and a bunch of things that didn't make as much money, let's put it that way, or some that made less money or no money. And that can be fatal. And I think that Three Body Problem gained from being the Chinese science fiction that people are going to read. And until recently, was working at a bookstore, and it was still selling huge numbers at the store. People who did not only buy science fiction bought Three Body Problem, so it was that sort of crossover. But the sequels and the related books, much less, which is not atypical. Usually, book number 1 sells this, and book number 2 sells 20% less, and 50% less, going downward. But for Three Body Problem, at least locally, we would sell a few hundred copies of that, and maybe 40 of book 2 and 20 of book 3, which is a very big collapse of sales, which tells me that people are buying it for almost sort of semi-woke reasons. They want to be cosmopolitan and international, but not that much. So it's become the one book. And why would it become the one book? I think, despite my personal loathing of them, the footnotes were of great help to American readers. And when I was editing Japanese stuff, I always struggled against the footnote. I couldn't stand the footnote. I would do tons of rewriting to make sure they wouldn't have to have a footnote. And this is always a big issue inside translating Japanese stuff. I remember reading stuff from other publishers that would even have long footnotes about sensei, which is the word we all kind of know, but it has different connotations. And you would call the guy who cut your meat at the deli sensei if you do a good job of it. Or any journalist would be a sensei, because they're kind of like a smart, hip guy. So it doesn't just mean teacher or martial arts instructor or that sort of thing. But you don't need to know that in a footnote for one sentence, was my point of view. But Tor with Three Bottom Home said, yes, we're going to tell you what the Cultural Revolution is. So they assumed a very kind of casual audience for things like world history or news or how physics work. And it seems weird, but that's helped people who who don't really read a lot of books read that book.
I personally am not anti-footnotes in there, and I sometimes, especially with the Chinese ones, don't need them a lot of times because I've read a lot of Chinese fiction and, wrote a poor attempt at a wuxia novel at one point that, hey, got published, but the point is that I don't need them a lot of times, but I appreciate them. I sometimes ignore them, but I'm not against those, but I understand why you did what you did, Nick, and why you worked around them, because I can see where they're off-putting to some people. But just
I will say, in this case, it was an inspired idea. I think it really helped.
Yeah,
I think you don't read a lot of science fiction or know a lot about China to get through the book.
I think when I had...
Sorry. They learned some, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, I'm being rude, but I think if we're talking about the footnoting by Tor in the Three Body books, I think I grilled is a strong word, but I think I questioned Ken Liu about how he does footnotes in his translations of stuff, because he's the guy writing them, although what I don't know is whether he's asked to write one or whether he wrote more and Tor cut them out. But if you go through the Three Body books, there are footnotes, but they're not in excess. It's not like it's an academic book. And I think just in general, he's an amazing example of a Chinese to English translator, as someone who's able to double up as an editor, or someone who has skill as a writer, who doesn't just machine translate stuff, and who knows how to handle the sort of cultural exchange, putting himself in the feet of the different readers and whatnot. And just in general, as like a facilitator of cultural exchange, Ken Liu's has done an amazing job. And we might get a chance to talk about it on the show, but he's one of the key players in how Three Body ended up in English. He's not the person who instigated it, but yeah, the whole business of translating in the broader sense culturally, I think, as well as giving credit to Tor, Ken Liu deserves a lot of credit, because he's
Absolutely.
a very proactive translator, and a smart one too.
Yeah, Ken Liu, a flag bearer, really, for Chinese sci-fi, like for sure.
I published a story by Ken in one of our Japanese anthologies called The Future of Japanese, and it won the Hugo Award.
Oh, sweet.
It was called Mono no Aware, and we had some negative feedback from some people who are not Japanese, saying, this book is called The Future of Japanese, and the first story is Ken Liu's Mono no Aware, which has one Japanese person in it, and he gets killed. He kills himself to save a bunch of white people after the world ends. How dare you do this? In Japan, this was a huge story that people loved. I remember my boss coming to me saying, is Ken married to a Japanese woman? How does he know so much about Japan? How does he understand Japanese so much? And when it got translated back into Japanese, people loved that story and were thrilled about it. And I asked the author, Enjo Cho, what did you think that Ken Liu killed everybody in Japan? Then he killed the last Japanese guy too. I said, we do that all the time. In Japanese country, we're always killing Japan, every Japanese person in Japan. So it felt very Japanese to them. So he absolutely an incredible ability to navigate different cultures. Not just Chinese culture, but also Japanese culture.
A thing that really cemented that for me, and that he's good at looking at the bigger picture, not just China but also China's neighbors, is in his translation of Waste Tide by Chen Qiufan, which has loan words aplenty as well as footnotes, so words from other languages into English but preserved, and I think they're in italics in Waste Tide. But it's not just Mandarin Chinese words. There's Mandarin Chinese, there's Cantonese, there's the local Chaoxianhua, which there is another word for, but
Shantou.
the local, yes,
Yeah.
that one, yeah, Shantou dialect. There are Japanese words. There might be some other ones too, but it doesn't surprise me at all that he was very apt at handling a story set in Japan, because he's
very accessible. The English version of Waste Tide, I think, is interesting because all those Chinese terms that are technically dialect, I don't read them as dialect when I'm reading in Chinese, right? Because I only speak Mandarin, so I read those as Mandarin terms,
right?
Maybe words that I don't know, and there are a lot of those, and so it pops out more saliently in the English version, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get into short stories a little bit, because short stories are very important in both countries. And starting with Tyran and working our way back, short story, particularly short story writers, authors that really just kick ass in short story form from Japan.
I'm actually far more familiar with novelists, but I will say, though, that my current favorite Japanese sci-fi author is Kitano Yusaku. I translated and published his novel Mr. Turtle with Kuroda-han a few years back. But one thing that he's been doing as of late is something that he calls micro novels, and these are basically tweet-long stories. And I've published a few of them. I say published, but I've had some of my translations of those appear online in sfintranslation.com, and I'm planning on hopefully doing all of them someday. But they are being published serially in Japan in hard copies. But they're really fun, though, and I'd say they are, I think, 100 Japanese characters each, around there. But they really tell a lot in very few words. And I've seen a lot of people do that kind of thing, but I think his is the most successful in Japanese anyway. So I really enjoy those.
And Tyran, what kinds of is there a style that's most popular of science fiction, hard sci-fi, cyberpunk, whatever in Japan, or is it kind of all over the place?
I don't know. I think it's been all. I mean, Nick can probably speak very well to that as well. But I would say that, interestingly enough, I think Philip K. Dick has been a huge influence on authors that are probably in sort of the upper echelon of, So, for example, one of my all-time favorite Japanese sci-fi authors is Kambayashi Chohei, whose Yukikaze has been published in Taikosoru. And my favorite novels of him have not, seen an English publisher, probably never will because they're just so long. But my favorite of his is called Hadai no Shita, which means Under the Skin. And it is a trilogy, or the third book in a trilogy called Mars Third Sector. And it's about a future in which humanity, after a nuclear holocaust, has gone to Mars and farmed underground to live there. And they send these human sentries up on the surface with android escorts to patrol, the surface of the planet. And in the beginning of the novel, one of the androids is on a standard tactical mission, decides to get out of the way of an oncoming bullet, thereby killing his human comrade who he was supposed to protect. And so this sets up a whole series of events in which androids' self-protective mechanisms has become an inevitability, because if you're going to program androids to be sentient fully, then of course they were going to preserve themselves at the cost of all others. And the author has explicitly stated that I got this from PKD, and this is like totally my inspiration, my foundation. And you see those themes appear in a lot of his works as well. And I think that sort of had a ripple effect, among authors of his generation. But again, I really think it's all over the map.
He does not care about Asimov's 3 laws.
Well, he's critiquing it too. He's critiquing it at the same time.
yeah.
That Dick and Asimov are kind of at opposite ends of American science fiction of the 70s, where we have to be rationalistic, and post-religionists go, oh no, we don't. Thing.
Well, sticking with Japan, and then we'll dive into to China. But Nick, who are the authors that you think are the high water mark, whether it's short story or novels? We don't have to focus just on short stories, but
one reason why I almost never even invite the podcast is I'm always objecting to the premise of a question. So here I go again. I'm objecting to the premise of your question.
No, it's fine.
Because a not insignificant number of Japanese novels are several Japanese short stories stapled together.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The fix-up, as they would call it in the U.S., is very common, partially because we were talking about where a lot of stuff happens in magazines first, and then they become books, which is what used to happen in the U.S. in the olden days. So one person I would like is Harishi Yamamoto. We did 2 books of his back at Haiku, both of which were novels, but if you read them, they're not novels. One of which is called The Stories of Ibis, which is about a guy in the future who's kind of human. He gets kidnapped by this android who has a special message for him. And the message is, amazingly enough, suggested to him via her reading him 7 short stories. That Yamamoto happened to write in years past. And the second book we did of his was called MM9, Monster of Magnitude 9. It's where kaiju and other monsters that are kind of smaller than kaiju are treated like the weather. It's monster weather out there. It's an MMA, it's an MM7, and a bunch of scientists are trying to thwart these monsters. It's also reminiscent of Ultraman without actually having an Ultraman character. So without the big fight with a robot between a robot and kaiju, they're trying to work out scientifically how to thwart these monsters. And of course, every chapter is a different monster, and of course, every chapter is a different short story that previously appeared with some flavor text. And many of the books that we did were collections of sorts. And one great book we did, one of the last great books we did was Suspian. And that too was 3 novellas in a row. Mm-hmm. So I would say that the why we shouldn't make the distinction that, and you said, oh, don't make a distinction, was we don't need to because they don't. Meaning that many authors in Japan will write a short treatment and then expand it on another story and then remix them or just even order them into a novel. So the Japanese science fiction's notion of a novel is very loose compared to an American notion of a novel. Even
also,
I was mentioning Yukokaze. The first Yukokaze book is 7 stories. Mm-hmm. The second Yukokaze book, Good Luck to Yukokaze, is a novel, as we would understand it. It was written all at once about one stream of events. Mm. Well, so if you want to find a good Japanese short story collection, just buy any novel.
Yeah.
It's going to be a short story collection.
Well, I mentioned too that there was actually a brief trend of toilet paper novels that were printed on rolls of toilet paper, and Suzuki Koji of Ring fame had a novel published on a toilet paper roll. Oh, there it is. Yes, well, I used to have that exact same one, and I sold it to Drop. It's called. Yeah, and of course, subway novels are also a pretty big thing. People will publish stories serially in subway advertising cards on the train, and then those will be published later. So.
Well, I think there's a tradition of that in science fiction here too, because the fix-up novel was a much bigger thing in the 30s through 50s. Really, I think it was the 60s where that kind of practice, kind of fell away. But I mean, even since we've been doing the Dickheads podcast, like a lot of the, early PKD were sometimes 3 stories stitched together, and that where he created framing devices. So he did that too. Particularly, Penultimate Truth is a great example of one that kind of worked, and then the Unteleported Man PKD is one that didn't work, where he added to it, but so much. But
didn't it happen with
magazines declined in the U.S.
Yeah,
and they've not declined in Japan, partially because of commuter culture, partially because the language is very context dependent and lends itself to short, denser pages, essentially, where you can get a lot more cognitive information out of a short story in Japanese than in English. And so that process is continuing in Japan for a variety of material, economic, and socio-cognitive reasons.
Didn't that happen with the Baroque cycle, though? I mean, like, I think Quicksilver was originally 3 shorter novels, right? And then it just got marketed as the tome, so people would have to carry it around.
Yeah, we see it occasionally here, but not nearly as common.
But yeah, that's sort of an anomaly, I guess.
So with Chinese science fiction, with this, I know the distinction between science fiction, horror, fantasy is a lot thinner. So Han Song's a great example of that because his primer was published by a horror publisher here, and that's kind of, and his stories are very surreal. But I think that surreal nature is something that sometimes I think just reading a book from another culture that you don't understand is going to make it feel a little bit more surreal. For example, Folding Beijing was, for example, it's an award-winning short story that was in Invisible Planets. And I actually kind of saw this as more kind of PKD-ish. I thought it was I didn't see it as surreal or fantastical, and I've seen it described as a surreal story a couple times by American reviewers, and I don't see it that way. But I think sometimes that just like if you have no context for China and you're reading something like this, that maybe it comes off like that. But
yeah, if you think they're all rice farmers, it's very strange. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Nathaniel, starting with Nathaniel and then going to Angus, who are some of the writers that you feel are the upper echelon, the ones that people cannot miss?
I guess since Han Song is already getting plugged, I'm going to skip over him. But I obviously really stan him, right? I do as much translation of his stuff as I can. Yeah. The other person who I sort of had discounted previously, and then after COVID I really came to love, and my students love, is Xia Jia. And her story, Tong Tong Summer, about the little girl who interacts with her grandparents through this sort of internet prosthesis cyborg creature, right? And I didn't like that very much the first time around, and then rereading it after we've now been put into this world where that's our daily existence, I thought it was much more poignant. And for having students read it, it was just way too on the nose. And so I think Xia Jia is like, I don't think she would mind if I said she's a very feminine author, and maybe the kind of person that I would sort of discount sometimes because I love Han Song where anything goes wrong and people just start eating and fucking each other. And that's that's my cup of tea, right? And
he's not exaggerating.
Yeah.
It's true.
All of his stories. Xia Jia is the opposite of that, right? It's really tender, really interesting in a different way. These like contemplative pieces about the nature of human intelligence and artificial intelligence, and I kind of miss her, and I think that other people might really actually enjoy that. The other guy I'd like to plug, or person I'd like to plug, is Ji Dawei, who's a Taiwanese author, and they have a novella coming out called Membrane. With Columbia University Press, and Ji Dawei writes a lot of stuff that's deals with gender issues and queerness, and is very Philip K. Dickian with like lots of implanted memories and people grown in test tubes. And the main character in Membrane is named Momo, and it's sort of a reference to the Momotaro, right, the peach boy who's born out of the peach. And also to the Chinese word for membrane, because we find out that this character, Momo, has basically been grown in a test tube and given these memories. And so you don't really know where they come from or how they came to be. But Ji Dawei is really cool and very different. And I would say really different from the mainland China stuff because it deals with gender in a way that I don't think you can get away with, or at least I haven't seen in the mainland China authors.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't think about nearby countries that were publishing in kind of the same languages and stuff. That's interesting. Now, yeah, with Han Song, it's funny. He has like a story for every mode of transportation that you could be trapped in as well. And the story with the subway train with the people trapped in the never-ending looping subway train was one that was particularly powerful to me of the collection that I read. and then I realized that was that trapped in transportation theme is something that I think we'll see much more of when we read more Han Sung. Is he one of the more he's one of the more rebellious authors, right? From this.
I think he actually really wonderfully illustrates what Angus is talking about in terms of this like problematic binary between dissident and nationalist.
You can be both.
Yeah, he works for the Xinhua news agency, right? He writes propaganda by day. It would be like Sean Hannity cranking out stuff like that at night, right? Or maybe not Hannity, because he's not insane like Hannity, but he's producing state propaganda.
He's insane, different from
and he's absolutely a Chinese nationalist, but in a very critical way, right? In a way that's critical of technology. And so it's really hard to pin him down because he brings out all these really dark sides of China's modernization. But he absolutely is in favor of, he's not a dissident. Definitely not a dissident.
Well, right, and Waste Tide is the same thing. Like, it's a very politically sharp novel, I think, but I don't think that it's like a wagging a finger at the country so much as the role that China has become part of the electronics dumping ground of the world is what Waste Tide is dealing with. I loved Waste Tide. I thought this book was incredible. It has Japanese flavor because it has giant mecha suits and it has like things like that going on. But man, this one just kicked. I just read it a couple months ago, and it's definitely one of my top reads of the year. I thought it was incredible. Is there anything I'm missing not reading it in the original language is what I'm wondering.
So I was mentioning before about key players and the bringing of Liu Cixin and everything that got bundled afterwards to English. I don't remember her name, but the editor at Tor is quite important. She's a woman, and I think Liu Cixin grumbled about her, calling her the feminist editor at Tor. And so a difference in three body and English three body, which is not, I think this is not so exceptional for translation from Chinese to English, is the way women are referred less. References to women, things like referring to them as very cute or, that are irrelevant to the actual description, that's gone. And Chen Qiufan has actually talked quite openly about how he thinks the English version of Waste Tide is improved in some ways because the editor took him took the novel to task on some of the way it treated or depicted Mimi, the main character, who's a young and very vulnerable girl. So there's quite big differences in how Mimi is treated, I guess, in the English and the Chinese version. There's a disturbing scene where she's violated, and I think in the Chinese version, I could be slightly wrong here, I think in the Chinese version it's just rape, and in the English version it's some weird technology. So they didn't remove the disturbing content, they came up with like a creative solution, and Chen Qiufan, at least as far as he said, it thinks it's pretty good. He thinks it's an improvement. And I think some of that has been added to new Chinese editions. I think the Chinese edition has been informed by the translation. If Qiufan was here, he could explain that more clearly, but I think that's the general gist of some differences that are really interesting.
Yeah, I do think the last time that both Angus and I heard Chen Qiufan talking, he sort of, it sounded like he had come around to kind of agree with me that the like octopus apparatus rape thing is actually creepier than just the direct version in the Chinese story. I don't know how much we want to talk about that. But yeah, it is really interesting the way that there's this circulation between the Chinese and the English, especially with him. And the Chinese editions are reflecting some of the English edits that Ken Liu is suggesting to him, and then he's bringing that back into his own work.
Yeah, I guess it's not just the Tor editor, but Ken Liu is a little bit of an editor himself. Yeah.
Yeah, he has an open invite to come on and talk about Waste Tide anytime on Dickheads.
I know he's a dickhead too.
Yeah, I'm aware. Yeah, I definitely would love to have him on there. I love Waste Tide, and I'd love an excuse to read it again. So getting back a little bit to Japan, and we'll shift back into. So I think the high watermark for for me, the high water mark is Waist Tide for Chinese science fiction that I've read so far, just me personally. Well, maybe Vagabonds might be better. I'm not sure it's my favorite, but is there a high water mark, Nick or Tyron, that you think is like, if you're going to read one Japanese translation or one or two, like, do you have a high water mark for yourselves, whether it's manga or prose?
I would defer to Nick on that one because I think Heiko Soto has, with his guidance and amazing editorial acumen, really put out a very specially curated corpus of literature. And I would love to hear some of your favorites, Nick.
I was going to say the same thing to kick it back to Tyran. Actually, I will mention a few books that I think were important that we did, and a couple other things too. My personal favorites were two books by Project Ito, the now late author, Genocidal Organ and Harmony, and perversely we put them out in reverse order in the U.S. We put out Harmony first and then Genocidal Organ, so it reads like a prequel, but actually Genocidal Organ was published first, it's meant to be read first. It is basically about how much Project Ito hates Noam Chomsky, but it's also about a dystopian future where child slaves are making clone dolphins and torturing them for their skin to make weapons for special forces soldiers. Like, it's every little satirical thing you could possibly imagine. And it's basically about neuro-linguistic programming to create genocides. Then Harmony, all those problems are all over. It's been solved. Everyone is super healthy. Everyone is super great. And then someone dares to try to commit suicide. And it is about a tyranny of universal healthcare. Ito was very oddly super skeptical and very unusually for Japanese writers, and frankly, Japanese politics was almost like libertarian. I'm not a libertarian at all, but as a satire, these things are incredibly potent books. So I like those two. One I'd be very remiss not to mention, and Tyron's worked on some of these, is the 10-volume Legend of the Galactic Heroes series, which is an immense epic of it's essentially the Prussian Wars, the Hundred Years' Wars in space with Napoleonic naval tactics. So if you're looking for how spaceships would work, they're not going to work like that. But if you're looking for endless twists and turns, dozens and dozens of characters, also an incredibly famous manga and anime. I've definitely all 10 volumes of that, and I think you worked on 4 of them or 5 of them?
3 in full, others partially, yeah.
Yeah. And you did some
work
when we realized one of our translators like, have the book for your March, but it's coming out in March. We had to get Tyran in there to crack the whip on him. And one other book I loved is Enjo To's Self-Reference Engine, which is hard, gonzo, semi-Phildickian, semi-Lovecraftian, mathematical hard SF short fiction as a novel, which involves things like talking socks. And Enjo was here, and he speaks this in English, and I remember interviewing him once at a bookstore event, and said, we have to get this idea for talking socks that are actually also black hole tubes and also Cthulhu. It's like, it's a true story. His response. So you have to check out Enjo To's Self-Reference Engine. He's also been published Why the Otherwise. He had a story in Granta, the very famous literary journal, and has been kicking around since then. So those are my high points. Meaning I had some personal affection for them beyond my personal affection for every book I've done. But as far as manga, I mean, you have to read Tetsuo Nabe, you have to read Astro Boy. 50 years of it. You have to read Sailor Moon. Is incredibly seminal. I'm mentioning things that children read, but these are things that are incredibly important, to understand Japanese science fiction and fantasy. And Tyran, how about you? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I would say, I don't know. I mean, I'm only just thinking about this now, but I think I might answer it differently depending on the category. So one category I would place these choices in is things that I've read but haven't translated. So in that category, I would probably place either the aforementioned Kambayashi novel, Under the Skin, or a novel by Sena Hideaki, the author of Parasite Eve, called Brain Valley, which is a duology about kind of like artificial intelligence and neurotransmitters. It's pretty fascinating, but another sort of gargantuan hard sell, in English, so I never really touched it. In terms of books that I have translated, my all-time favorite is Mr. Turtle, which I mentioned before, which is about a cybernetic turtle who is trying to make it in a world of humans. He's a blue-collar worker at a factory who drives a forklift, but has these traumatic memories of having been deployed as an instrument of war, and is trying to deal with the, militaristic purpose for which he was created, and then trying to live a daily life among his creators, and dealing with the fact that no amount of computer erasure or digital erasure can actually disconnect him from those traumatic. Yes, there is.
Wow. I've already written that one down. So
yeah, and then the other thing I would say is probably fiction that I have seen translated by others, which I sort of kind of place in its own category, because I often discover things, that way. And some of the stuff that, Nick already mentioned is, firmly on that list, but especially Ito. I mean, the Project Ito stuff is quite brilliant. And it was stuff that I wasn't even familiar with in Japanese. So it's been sort of a retroactive, introduction to me. So yeah, I guess those would be sort of my top ones for now.
yeah, and I read a fair bit of. There's one guy, I can't remember his name, Ken something. He writes tons of Lovecraftian fiction in Japan.
Atsumasa Ken, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I for whatever reason, Kurodon has sent me tons of his work, so I've read and so I feel terrible not remembering his name, but those are really hit or miss. But when he's really on it, some of the Lovecraftian stuff is really great, and some of the better Lovecraftian stuff that I've read, and and I find it really interesting to think about how mythos and Lovecraft translates to Japanese culture in particular, considering what a racist dickbag Howard was. But in that context, I find it really funny.
I translated one of his stories for those anthologies, and he's also very, very smart, because I actually interviewed him for my dissertation for the section I did on Japanese horror, and he has a lot of very arcane knowledge of the genre and its history, in both within and without Japan. And he's
that leads through the pages in his story. Very, very obvious. And I feel bad that I didn't remember his name, because I literally have like 5 of them. So I want to talk about, now there's lots of subgenres in science fiction, the cyberpunk, the this or that. One that I feel is emerging is the novels inspired by Le Guin's The Dispossessed, because there's literally probably half a dozen of those novels that are clearly influenced by The Dispossessed, and one of those is Vagabonds by Hong Jingfang, which I think is, and I hope I pronounced that correct, probably not. But Vagabonds, I just read, it's the most recent Chinese science fiction that I've read, and so it's on my mind a lot. But this book is a sprawling epic, and I think her role, because she's famous in China for not being a science fiction writer, correct? And so she's more famous as an education reformer, and I learned this when I was about 100 pages into the book. I was like, well, I want to learn more about her. And I looked up on YouTube to see if there were any interviews, and they were all about school reform in China. And I was like, wow. And so what I noticed is that as I was getting into it, that I was starting to have a little bit of the same knee-jerk reaction that people are having, and I was trying to correct myself. And I know, Angus, you dealt with this with your Ken Liu interview very well, how there's this kind of rush to assume that Vagabonds is saying Mars is China and Earth is America, and make this one-to-one comparison, but it's a totally wrong reading of the book.
Yeah, well, right away, as a European, I would say don't conflate America and the West. And that's just a starter. There's lots of other things that we must not conflate as well.
Right. And for one thing, like Mars has like a very tiny population in Vagabonds, so it would be impossible to compare Mars of this novel to China. But one of the things that's really interesting is that the author, she is an idealist. She's very much an idealist as far as Japan goes, and she's like a mom, and she's a teacher, and she wants to. And so I think in a lot of ways, this book, it's very influenced by the dispossessed, but not at all the same point of view. So what do you guys think about Vagabonds? Am I reading this wrong, or like this book I thought was incredible. I don't think it's for everyone because, like it's for Kim Stanley Robinson readers, for example, because it's social science fiction, right? What do you guys think about Vagabonds, starting with Angus?
Yeah, I think if you go in looking for any kind of one-on-one reading, whether it's the kind of default Westerner or any kind of other alternative one-to-one reading, you will be disappointed because it's very multifaceted and complex, and it's deliberately very subtle. Like the book never erupts into a war. There's never very clear goodies and baddies. I think maybe an interesting way I can talk about it is just based on the fact I have also read The Dispossessed, luckily enough. And what I remember about The Dispossessed is that although Ursula K. Le Guin, I'll just call her Ursula Le Guin, although she clearly preferred her sort of anarchist or socialist, whatever you'd call it, idealistic vision of Mars, she although she was careful to not make it absolutely perfect, you could clearly see that she thought it was a better life, or at least a better life. It's the way people should be living. Whereas in Vagabonds, the impression I got is that Ha Jingfang wasn't very fully decided herself, because there's some, although the Mars that have been created by some people is probably a more moral place, it has some she's very honest about the failings. So I don't know if I could summarize it very, very simply for anyone who's not read the book. It's like thing is, I don't remember it that well myself. It's a while since I've read it, but it's a planned society. Basically, it's a planned non-economy. It's very like, the thing that makes it not very communist is that it's driven by ideas and culture and individual creativity to some extent. Whereas like the ideal, like communist China in the 50s and 60s was very not focused on pursuing your own philosophical ideas or creativity. It was hyper industrial. Whereas the society in Vagabonds that is mega focused on economic growth is Earth. I'm going to need a minute to get my thoughts back together. I've spiraled off in lots of different directions.
What I would say for me that I thought the very, where you saw her Chinese perspective really coming through in the book, is that the main character was trying to come to grips with, the main character's grandfather was kind of like the leader of Mars, and she was like grappling with, are you a dictator? Are you an authoritarian? Because you seem really great to me. But, and so it kind of had this, where she was trying to parse out that question for herself, like, I'm very happy with the way I'm personally living, but are we, at least that's how it took to me. Nathaniel, have you read Vagabonds? Or?
I'm sad to say I haven't. I mean, but, as far as reading things in terms of a national allegory, that's something we would always caution against, right? And I think something you can see in Hao Jingfang's other writing, or in Han Song's writing, is that you can be critical of your country but still really love it, right? So just reading it really purely in that way is definitely problematic.
And in Chinese, there's acceptable critical discourse, and there's censored and go to jail critical discourse. But probably actually go to jail is an exaggeration. I think generally if you're writing something that the government doesn't want to see, your editor will stop you. And if your editor can't accept it, your book just won't be published. If things come to a head and your publisher publishes a book, then your book will not go to distribution, and your publishing house might get shut, or the publishing house that chose to help you out or be your partner will get shut down. So yeah. So, but within what is allowed to be published, there's plenty of stuff which is not following everything Xi Jinping says. And nationalism is probably one axis where there is a spectrum of opinion, because it's not, nationalism is almost by definition not trying to bring down the country. So.
Yeah, and as great as Vagabonds is, I think her short story, Folding Beijing, is one of the most incredible short stories I've read from either country. As far as it's incredible. It's an incredible story, and it blew me away when I read it. And so that's why I was like, I'm going to read Vagabonds right away. And I definitely have, and I put a lot of energy into that, my review of Vagabonds, to not assume that I understood what Han Jifeng was saying entirely, but I think the conversation she's having with the dispossessed is really interesting. And so let's we've been talking for a while, and I don't want to take too much, especially Angus, it's late at night for you, but I just want to kind of go around and say, like, where do you want people to start if they're going to start seeking out English translations? And starting with Tyran, English translations from Japanese science fiction or manga, like, where do you want us to start? And and then we'll just go around with that.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with Nick about Astro Boy. I mean, that's an amazing place to start if you sort of want to go chronologically. I think also Legend of the Galactic Heroes, if one can stomach a 10-volume series, is really classic in every sense of the word. And it's also, I mean, I'm not a huge hard sci-fi fan, but when it's good, it's good. And I think Tanaka does such a brilliant job in that entire series of making it realistic, not only because it's grounded in history, but because it is grounded in I don't know, I guess social complexity in a way that's very fun. But it also has a bit of enough unrealism to make it just a touch campy here and there to kind of give the reader some titillation, so that you're not bogged down by politics too much. But I also think that, film is another thing that we didn't really mention. I mean, the 1954 Godzilla is a real masterpiece, I think, of contemporary Japanese science fiction narratives. I teach it in my courses all the time, whether it's a Japanese film course or this past semester I just taught a Japanese pop culture course, and that was like a touchstone, of the class, because it ties together so many concerns, both at the national level, but also at the historical level, social level, but the literary level as well. Because despite the questionable nature of its many spin-offs, it was a real touchstone for activating again those very explicit nuclear anxieties that were still resonating throughout the country in the wake of the war.
Let's stick with Japan. Nick, where do you think people should start?
There's a weird paradox involved in recommending something. I remember about a few months ago when I was working at the bookstore, I was talking to a customer. I said, "Do you want to read the best fantasy novel ever written?" She thought, "Of course I do." So here you go, it's Little Big by John Crowley. And she bought the book and came back months later and said, "Oh, I read that book. That was the most amazing book I've ever read. Most amazing fantasy novel ever. Do you have anything else like it?" I said, "Of course not." Every recommendation I have from now on is to be worse, because I gave you the best. So I ruined you for fantasy. So now I'm very wary of recommending the best Japanese science fiction, because you'll read it and then everything else will be shitty compared to it. So what I'd recommend readers and podcast listeners out there in podcast land is going to your local shelf at the local bookstore, inside a real physical bookstore, and seeing what is available, and just picking what calls to you. Give yourself a chance. Be an aesthetic explorer. Because if you start off reading the best thing ever, everything else is going to be worse afterward. And that's not a cop-out. That's just me realizing that if I happen to hit on the best thing possible, then you'll be spoiled forever. Because reality is, if you read a lot of books, you read a lot of mediocre books that are kind of pretty good, and kind of pretty good. But if you're dealing with a minority culture or a minority code in some kind of publishing, only the best come out. And thus, when we only have the best, we don't have a lot. And I'd want people to sort of read broadly in Japanese science fiction or in any kind of science fiction or reading. So I would say, don't get random, but pick something that seems interesting to you. And just give it a whirl. Spend the $20 and the 2 weeks or whatever it takes, and just see how it goes.
Angus.
Hello. I actually have a pre-made answer. So recently, Paper Republic, who are an amazing organization for kind of organizing, listing, and popularizing Chinese fiction and translation, or literature and translation, they got in touch with me looking for some little quick 100-word pieces of writing on some Chinese short stories I liked, and I chose all science fiction because I thought this is something I know that even some of the really big geniuses affiliated with Paper Republic might not. So I'll adopt a slightly stilted tone and just read these out. They're all short stories, and which I think is important because although there's only a few novels, well, there's lots of Liu Cixin novels you can get in English. Apart from that, just a few others like Waste Tide and Vagabonds. But there is an absolute boatload of translated Chinese sci-fi you can read in English, on print and online, and often for free. So here we go. First of the three is What Has Passed Shall in Kinder Light Appear. And this is by Bao Shu, translated by Ken Liu. And you can read in Ken Liu's Broken Stars anthology. Bao Shu is known for The Redemption of Time, his fanboy genius three-body extension. In The Redemption of Time, Bao Shu proved he can bend your mind like Leo, but in WHPSIKLA, What Has Passed Shall in Kinder Light Appear, he sets out to go one better and break your heart. Early in the 20th century, history reverses. As our narrator grows from anxious prodigy to broken man, technology communications deteriorate, separating him from the childhood companion he primes for. At the macro level, Bao Shu executes his temporal conceit brilliantly, showing us a strange but familiar era of ruin and revolution that erodes but never quite eliminates the tender souls lost within it. This one messed me up even more than the end of Death's End did. It will make you cry. Second one is a Han Song story. It's called The Passengers and Creators, and someone sitting in this Zoom meeting room translated it. It was Nathaniel. You can get this one in The Reincarnated Giant, which is a slightly less slickly published anthology of translated Chinese sci-fi, but there's some really interesting stuff there, and it's arguably more diverse than Ken Liu's anthologies for various different reasons. But also, I think the Chinese University of Hong Kong have this on their website. You can't find it by navigating through it, but if you Google search the story, you should be able to get the PDF that's up there. So you can slightly dubiously read this one online for free. I think I won't read the whole blurb because it took me too long to do that first one. But basically, it's a bit like the film Snowpiercer on a plane, and it was written long before Snowpiercer, I think. So it's a really good sample of Han Song's, both his tendency for people to murder, eat, oppress, and sometimes shag each other on public transport. And it's very... This one, actually, I know we said reading as national allegory is a no-no, but this one works in all sorts of interesting ways as a national allegory. So if you want to kind of be a bit naughty and think about how is this story exactly a metaphor for modern China, I think you can be forgiven for doing that for this story. And the last one, this is one I think is really worth mentioning because not only is this a younger author like Bao Shu, who's in the generation after Liu Cixin, it's a woman. It's Tang Fei, and this one's also translated by Ken Liu, and it's called Broken Stars. So it's the story that Ken Liu's Broken Stars anthology was named after, funnily enough. And you can also read it online at SQ Mag. Probably if you Google it, you'll find it. And basically, this one is like, I'd say this is like a piece of weird fiction. It's very dark, and I think I will actually read you the blurb because I'm very proud of this blurb, and it does a better job than me rambling would do. Ken Liu's sci-fi anthologies host one Tang Fei story each, Call Girl and Broken Stars. Among clear-cut genre fare, both are dark slipstream invaders, where the bait and switch of Call Girl reminded me of Jonathan Glazer's film Under the Skin. Funny that that title comes up again in our chat. The creeping psychosexual malaise of Broken Stars reminds me most of Robert Aickman's Strange Tales. Here and in Aickman, the reader day and or fever dreams a mundane life, an unkind world, and the threat of undefinable darkness breaking through. But rather than a mumbling, bumbling Aickman-esque protagonist, we follow something far more dangerous, an angry teenage girl. And yeah, I think this one, if I had to choose one story to set as a high watermark, I might choose this one, not because it's representative of really great Chinese sci-fi, but it's like an odd one out that is just absolutely not what you expect. And in some ways is maybe recognizably Chinese or East Asian, and in other ways, that's not even what you'll be thinking about when you're reading it. It's really something special. So yeah, short stories, those three are good places to start. If you look on clarksworld.com, they've got loads of great Chinese sci-fi, although that's not all they do.
All right, Nathaniel.
Yeah, agreed. I would go to Clark's World. I think they have a really great diversity of authors and translators on there, so you get a lot of different voices, and it's a great way to sample it and find out, what you do want to see more of, hopefully in print if it's out there. The Reincarnated Giant collection as well, I think, is a really good way to get. That splits itself between the early 20th century and the 21st century. And so what little there is of stuff that's from, turn of the 20th century from Chinese science fiction that's available in English is in that book. The other thing that I would go to, and you're only going to be able to get a sample and not a lot of other stuff because no one ever did this, but Science Fiction from China, published by Wu Dingbo in 1989, has a bunch of those 1980s kind of pulpy stories running up right up to the spiritual pollution campaign in 1983 that Angus was talking about. So if you want to get a feel for what happened between reform and opening up, and then that whole thing getting shut down again, that gives a little bit more historical diversity in there. I think it kind of helps round that out, hopefully.
All right, that's awesome. All right, so we're going to close it out. So I want, starting with Tyran, just let people know how they can find your work, and if you want them to get in touch with you, how they can find you. Starting with Tom.
These days, I am doing more of the music criticism thing, so you can find me on ecmreviews.com if you're interested. I'm also on Twitter under my name. If you just type my name into Amazon, you'll find my translations.
Cool. Angus, your podcast and you.
Yeah, send your hate mail to boris.johnson@gov.uk. On a serious note, yeah, the podcast it is hosted on Podbean, so to find all the links and show notes and episode art and whatnot, you go to churchoffic.podbean.com, churchoffic, so that's TRCHFIC, translated Chinese fiction, churchoffic.podbean.com. If you just search for TRCHFIC, you'll find all the various places where you can find the podcast, or you could just search for the Translated Chinese Fiction Podcast, and that's me, really.
I originally found you first on YouTube when I was for stuff like Vagabonds. And that's,
sorry, I kept butting in there. Sorry. Yes, I put every episode on YouTube and Spotify and all your different podcast providers. So wherever you fancy. I think I mainly put them on YouTube so people find it and then go find the main feed, because YouTube has the nice funky thumbnails and stuff. But if that's how you like to listen to podcasts, it works fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I found that too. Nathaniel.
The most recent tranche of Han Song translations that I have came out in the Dark Fiction series published by Eric Guignard. I think that's Dark Fiction book number 5, and I'd love it if you read that. I'm not very good at tweeting, so you can email me at nkisaacs@ncsu.edu. If you want to read a book about Chinese science fiction, my book is on Amazon.
It's really good.
And the title of that book is?
Celestial Empire, The Emergence of Chinese Science Fiction.
Yes. That is a done deal over here. And Nick?
Best way to find me is on Twitter and Mamatas, which is M-A-M-A, like Mama, T-A-S, T as in Thomas, all the vowels are A's. So to tell every telemarketer who's ever called me to get my name right. And I got a million things going on all the time. For Japanese essay, I'd recommend the 3 anthologies we did of Hakasuru. The Future of Japanese, which was about science fiction, Phantasm Japan, which was fantasy, and Hanzai Japan, which was a fantastical crime fiction. Hanzai is just crime in Japanese. So if you're looking for a sampler, I'd recommend all 3 of those anthologies.
And you have a new book out this year, Sabbath, correct?
I had 4 books out this year, even though I did almost nothing because they're all reissues. So my first novel, Move Underground, which was a beatnik Lovecraftian novel, is back out in print. Sabbath, which was a novel I wrote to make sure my kid can afford college, is out in paperback now. It's about a knight who chops off the heads of the 7 deadly sins. That was a work-for-hire book. I have an anthology, Wonder and Glory Forever, which was another Lovecraftian anthology based around the theme of the sublime and awe as opposed to dread. It has stories by Victor Laval, Molly Tanzer, Nadia Bolkin, Laird Barron in it, so please check that out. And last week came the reissue of my novel Bullet Time, which is about
I love Bullet.
universes wrapped up together around the axis of a school shooting.
Mm. Yeah, it's great. That was actually the first novel of yours I read. So, but yeah, so everybody, thanks for coming. I hope everybody checks out the Asian Fiction and Translation as we end every podcast. Keep it paranoid. Stay paranoid.